Hi, my name is Stephanie Weiss. I'm the Director of Education and Events for AGRiP. I want to say Happy New Year to all of you who are joining us and to thank you for taking time out today to learn about multi-generational workforces. With me today is my colleague Michelle Carter. She's our Director of Programs and Services. In today's webinar, AGRiP's generational resident Kim Lear is going to explain why generational theory matters to public entity pooling operations. Kim's research, her insights, and original concepts will prepare you to better understand the factors shaping the world around us and to take steps to reconcile the needs while leveraging the strengths of diverse multi-generational work teams for the benefit of your pool itself, but also for the benefit of your members. It's important to note that Kim is also going to be a keynote presenter at our upcoming Governance and Leadership Conference this March in San Diego. There, her keynote will focus on staff recruitment, retention, leadership development, and then will be followed by hands-on workshops designed to help pools assess their readiness for the workforce of the future. Now, before I hand things over to Kim, there's just a couple of housekeeping notes that I'd like to share with our group. First, all attendees are automatically on mute. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat or question field on the webinar panel. We'll address questions at the end of the presentation. We also have webinar slides that will be made available from this presentation on demand for members on the AGRiP website in the coming week or so. With that, I'd like to turn it over to AGRiP's generational resident, Kim Lear. Kim, thank you again for taking time to share your insight and expertise and to answer questions.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie, and thank you all for logging on today. It's been a privilege so far to work with AGRiP members, and I'm looking forward to this year as the generational resident. So on this webinar today, we are going to build some understanding around demographic shifts and generational personalities. And I've studied this topic of generations for about 12 years. And over this time, I've noticed something that many of you are probably aware of as well, which is that as soon as we start a conversation about generations, the conversation seems to go to a negative place very quickly. And inevitably, we end up talking about who had to climb uphill both ways in the snow to get to school, and who is stuck in their ways, and who's an entitled brat. And we get pigeonholed into these stereotypes that really do not fit us. And stereotyping and blaming create unnecessary tension and conflict. And I'm sure for many of you on this call, you can think of many positive intergenerational relationships that you have in your own life. So whether it's relationships with your children, your parents, coworkers, or so many others. And I tend to focus my research on these intergenerational relationships that work and figure out how to replicate those in order to have a more productive workforce and also how to better relate to members as well. But this generational hazing that we tend to do has been a part of the human condition for essentially since the beginning. There's a famous quote that says, "I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today." And I'm sure someone somewhere has said this today, but the first time this was actually said was in 8th century BC by Hesiod. So this has been part of our rhetoric. But it has become increasingly important to have meaningful conversations on this topic that move us past stereotyping because we are in the midst of a demographic shift. We have 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every single day in this country. Gen Xers are stepping into the C-suite and reinventing what leadership looks like. Millennials are becoming managers. They're becoming parents. They're entering a new life stage. And Generation Z is stepping into the workforce for the very first time. And in pooling, there are many important leaders who are reaching this retirement age. And many of these individuals are also founders of their pools, which adds on another layer of complexity to their retirement. And in addition, and I sincerely hope that this does not offend anyone, but pooling is not necessarily what some would classify as the sexiest industry in the world. So when we talk about recruitment, there are many great candidates out there who may be unaware of this industry and how much you really have to offer. So the time is now to understand how these generational personalities impact things like motivation. I hear in so many focus groups, someone will say, how come what motivated me in the workplace does not seem to motivate them? And that's something that we'll talk about. Understanding how generational personalities impact recruitment and retention, which, like Stephanie said, we'll focus on in the March keynote. And thinking about things like succession planning and knowledge transfer. And actually, in the intelligence publication coming out soon, the entire focus is on baby boomers, succession planning, and retirement. And so you'll get some more in-depth information on that. So in order to really see the world through the eyes of another generation, it's imperative to understand that the study of generations is not designed to encourage nostalgia for the way things used to be. The study of generations is designed to help us all understand and adapt to the way things are now. So that is really the focus of this study. So I'm going to get us started here on the ground level, and we'll look at who the generations are today. And actually they're not listed on here, but always worth mentioning, the traditionalists are a group born before 1946 into a group of 75 million. And during Q&A, if any of you have many traditionalist members, if you have traditionalist leaders that you have questions about, please feel free to ask those, and I can address that during Q&A. It's a very an important group that has left a lasting legacy on the way that we work today. But for the sake of time, which I want to be sensitive to for all of you, we're going to focus more on the baby boomers who are born between 1946 and 1964. They were born into a big group of 80 million people. After them is Generation X, born between 1965 and 1979, a much smaller group of 60 million. And in the Western world, you will see that Gen X is a much smaller generation. The main reason for that is this is when birth control became readily available, the birth control pill. So a much smaller generation there. Millennials are born between 1980 and 1995 into a group of about 82 million. And then Generation Z, roughly born between 96 and 2012. I think those dates will change a little bit. And they're born into a group of 72 million. Now, some of you may feel like you have one foot in one generation and one foot in the other. And if you do, that's fine. There's actually a chapter in the original textbook on generations. It's entitled Generations. It's by Strauss and Howe. And there's a chapter dedicated to you. It's called Cuspers. And this refers to people who sit in between two generations. Because, and if that's you, sometimes you may feel like you are not part of this generational conversation. But in reality, you play an important role in communicating. You can understand both perspectives and see both sides. So in your family or in the workplace, you may find yourself in this role of translator more often than maybe you would even prefer. But the other thing to know about these breakdowns is that the dates are just a starting place. So as you can imagine, it's not like someone goes to sleep on December 31st of one year and someone else wakes up January 1st of another year and is a different species. What we're really looking at here, the academic backbone of generational theory, is looking at events and conditions from our formative years. And formative years, these are roughly our teenage years. And it's during this time when we're coming to terms with the world around us. So what is happening in the world at that time has a lasting impact on how we view things like wealth and status, work ethic, politics, social justice. We all remember being teenagers, and some of you on here may currently be raising teenagers. And if that's the case, I am genuinely sorry for you. But it's during this time in brain development where teenage angst comes from. So perhaps your whole life, your parents taught you to think a certain way, act a certain way, vote a certain way, and one day you decide you're going to do it your own way. And it's that period of brain development that we study how these shared experiences result in behavioral patterns and consumer trends. And the other critical thing to understand is that generational theory is rooted in sociology, not psychology. And both are important, but psychology studies you as an individual. This is your family, your relationship to your parents, your siblings, your birth order, your religion. Where sociology studies groups of people and culture. So as with any sociological study, there are outliers. So we're not trying to put people in a box here. We're trying to observe patterns of our culture and what they can tell us about where we are now and where we're going in the future. So I want to look at the cultural backdrop of baby boomers. And my undergrad research is pretty much exclusively around boomers. And many researchers have had an ongoing fascination with this group for many reasons. First of all, this was the largest generation in American history, and that came with an unprecedented amount of power. Boomers grew up during this time of severe social fragmentation, but many of them rolled up their sleeves, they fought the good fight, and it was a result of this fight that we have a lot of the rights that we enjoy today. And just based on sheer size, they could push back and challenge the status quo. There were many boomers who thought that they could change the world, and then they saw the world change. And this helped to create a youth culture of optimism and idealism, this feeling that anything was possible. And I'll give you an example. One thing I'll do is separate focus groups by generation. And then into each focus group, I will bring an institution or an ideology and ask that group to talk to me about their first memory. So if I go into a baby boomer focus group and I ask them, tell me your first memory of NASA. Most, not all, but most boomers say landing on the moon. And when I ask them what that moment meant to them, what it felt like, I hear things like, it was this incredible moment of national pride, winning the space race, being taught that if you work hard enough and you have the right technology, the sky's the limit, you can do anything. Now, if I walk next door to the Gen X focus group and I ask them to tell me about their first memory of NASA, many of them will say the Challenger explosion. And Gen Xers remember that day exactly. There was a teacher on that shuttle, you watched it in school. And Xers will say to me, if I could have trusted anyone, I could have trusted the geniuses at NASA, but I was let down. And it was a moment of great disappointment. So depending on your generation, oh, yep. Sorry, I think Anne is trying to talk, but I cannot hear.
Kim, that's background noise. That's not us. I'm not quite sure where that feedback is coming from.
Oh, okay. Nope, not
Sorry.
coming from my. Can you still hear it?
I can't hear it anymore.
Okay. All right. Great. Just let me know if we're getting some feedback.
Okay. All right. And apologies, everyone, for that little interruption.
Oh no. So this NASA example shows how, depending on your generational vantage point, you can see the same institution very differently. And we look for these moments of generational juxtaposition in order to understand how these cultural perspectives are formed. But with boomers, like I said, it was more of this optimism and idealism. Now, one takeaway here for the people on this webinar is when working with boomers, whether they're colleagues or whether they're members, try to focus on the positive and find the silver lining. In marketing tests, even today, boomers prove to be more receptive to positive messaging rather than fear tactics. So if your pool is trying to get a change initiative through, it's focusing the messaging more on, we want these changes so that it can bring us to the next level, so that we can expand on where we've been, instead of saying something like, if we don't make these changes, we're going to fall behind. oftentimes that more positive messaging can get boomers more excited about what you're trying to do. Now back to these events and conditions, I do have to point out that there are some theorists who have split this boomer demographic because younger boomers have some different memories. And I talk to some of these younger boomers and they'll say things like, sure, I remember these big social movements, but I was 7. Maybe my older sibling was involved or I saw it on TV, but that was not really my teenage years. And for those younger boomers, there are some different memories. The main one is that this 80 million person population size had other implications besides power. The American infrastructure was not prepared for this massive boom in the population. So boomers flooded American institutions. Some of you on this call may remember coming to school, there were not always enough desks for everyone, not always enough books. You went to fill your car with gasoline, it was the oil embargo, there wasn't enough gas for everyone. You step into the workforce during scarcity of the 70s, and there were definitely not enough jobs. And boomers learned very early on that if you were not willing to stay late, there were 80 million people behind you, and they would take your job. Boomers became very competitive. They developed this incredible work ethic. And even now, when I ask boomers, what does a workday look like to you? They'll say, you arrive 5 minutes before your boss arrives, and you leave 5 minutes after your boss leaves. That's a workday. That's work ethic. Well, from a generational standpoint, we watch Gen Xers come into the workplace, and Gen Xers are really credited with bringing in major conversations about work-life balance. And Gen Xers came in and they said, I'm going to work my tail off from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., but I got to leave at 6 because I'm going to my kid's softball game. And that was pretty new in the workplace. And then Millennials came pouring into the workplace, and it was really brought to the next level. It was, I've got yoga at noon, I want to bring my dog to work. And boomers are thinking, what has happened to the way we are supposed to be working? So a couple of just comments and takeaways on this is, first is to understand that we have better ways of measuring productivity today than just time. And we have to find a way to focus more on results and less on the rules that were created in a different workplace environment. And understanding that what work ethic looks like does change based on generation oftentimes. And a good example of this is there was a experiment done at Accenture where they came up with many employee personas. And I'm sure you all know this, but a persona, it's a fake person who exhibits different behaviors. And one of these personas was an individual who was the first one in, the last one out, ate lunch in front of their computer. And when they showed this persona to some of the baby boomer leaders, many of them said, that is an incredible worker. Look at that. At their desk at 7 a.m., they're not going anywhere until 7 p.m., not even breaking for lunch. That is the type of worker we want. Well, they showed that same persona to Gen X and millennial leaders, and the responses were pretty different. And some of those leaders were saying things like, what is this person doing from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.? They can't even break for lunch. They must not have good time management skills, or they must not know how to appropriately prioritize their work. They must not really understand how to leverage technology in a way that would create more efficiency. So to one generation, what looks like great work ethic to another generation can look like inefficient work. So focus more on the results, less on the rules, and pools can go through the process of asking themselves, what are the cultural norms of our pool that we're holding on to that may no longer serve us? And you go through that exercise and may come to realize that there are some things that we do in our corporate cultures just because that's the way it's always been done, without really asking ourselves the critical questions of, is this reflective of our workforce today, and is this really moving us forward? So moving on from that, I just want to make a comment here about the life stage that baby boomers are in right now. Because like I said, we've got 10,000 boomers hitting retirement age, and this is definitely impacting the pooling industry. And talking about retirement, it opens up a whole conversation around identity after retirement, succession planning, knowledge transfer. And I'm not going to go heavy into this today because the intelligence publication, this is what it is solely focused on. But I wanted to bring it up because during Q&A, if anyone has any specific questions, I'm more than happy to answer that. But the major headline that you should know in regards to boomer retirement is that it does not look like anything we have seen before. And baby boomers have transformed every life stage they have touched. And it should come as no surprise that they're redefining what it means to age in this country. Their competitive spirit and their optimism have challenged so many preconceived notions around retirement and aging. And a few years ago, The Atlantic magazine, they did a series of photographs, and they were asking themselves, what will retirement look like as baby boomers age? And hopefully you can see this on your screen, but this was one of those photos. So obviously we are dealing with something totally different that we have never seen before. So the summary of the boomers is optimistic, idealistic, competitive. In terms of that optimism and idealism, focusing on the good, looking at the way even the words that you're using to communicate with your people, and figuring out if you're using that glass half full type of communication. When you're talking to some of your boomer members, focusing more on what is possible instead of just what is. And that competitive spirit, really looking at how that spirit of competition created our mindset around what work ethic looks like. But then looking really critically at, is that still what it looks like today? Is that still relevant in a workforce that is so heavily dependent on technology, which allows us to work in so many new ways and allows us to be productive in new ways? Focusing more on results and less on rules. And then the last is just understanding that retirement is so different, and therefore when and how people leave an organization has changed. And for much more detail on this, you can check out the intelligence publication. So with that, we're going to go into Gen X. And there are so many events and conditions that are fun to talk about with Gen X. I'm going to hone in on the event or condition that impacted above all else, which is the emergence of 24-hour media. And MTV was, in fact, an important part of the youth culture of Gen Xers, but even more important, this is when Ted Turner put CNN on the air. So this was the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. And everything that was happening in the world could be streaming in front of your 12-year-old eyes in your living room. And Gen X kids watched institutions that were built by traditionalists and improved upon by baby boomers all being called into question. And this was WorldCom and Enron, organized religion, sports, politics. In one of my focus groups a few years ago, a Gen Xer wanted to play a game. And the game was, you name the institution and I will name the crime. And that in many ways sums up some of the youth culture of that time. And as a result, Gen Xers became very skeptical. And it wasn't just these institutions falling apart on TV. The institution of marriage was also falling apart on the home front. So during the Gen X birth years, the divorce rate tripled. So you have a generation of kids who came home to empty homes. Either both parents were working. We saw an unprecedented number of women enter the workforce at this time, or the parents were divorced. And Gen Xers became fiercely independent. And even now in the workplace, when I ask Gen Xers, tell me your ideal work situation, they'll say, I want someone to tell me what they want, when they want it, how they want it. I want to go away. And ideally, I would like them to go away as well. And then I can get it done. So that spirit of independence shows up pretty strongly in some of these workforce patterns. So Gen Xers, big things to know is skeptical, very independent, and entrepreneurial. Gen Xers are the most entrepreneurial generation, and nearly 60% of startup founders in this country fall into the Gen X category. And that makes sense because you have a generation of young people who didn't really trust the system, and so they taught themselves how to work outside of it. So a few implications here regarding Gen X. The first on this topic of skepticism is to be aware that Gen Xers are very weary of institutions. So something to even think about with your members is that there will be more pushback oftentimes with Gen X members. And some of you may have already experienced this in your own life and in some of the conversations that you've had. And something that you can do is to anticipate and prepare for skepticism. So looking out there, even just doing a quick Google search on what is being said about the pooling industry. Because for a lot of Gen Xers, because they're skeptical, it doesn't really matter as much about what you say about your pool as much as it matters what other people are saying about your pool or about the industry as a whole. And so looking at what is being said, and if there is something negative or if I'm seeing a complaint or something like that, how can I get in front of that? How can I anticipate that? Because you can bet that some of these Gen Xers who are doing their homework are going to be asking about it. And if you can come out ahead of that, it goes a long way to build their trust. Now, this weariness of institutions also impacts some of the behaviors we're seeing in terms of Gen Xers' careers. Throughout their careers, I often find that they are much less likely than boomers to tie their identity to their job or profession. So, of course, they're still working hard, becoming great, strong leaders, but who they are as a person and what they do for a living have more of a separation than what we saw with boomers or traditionalists. And perhaps this is almost an act of self-preservation. Many Gen Xers during their formative years watched downsizing or quote-unquote right-sizing, and they watched companies disappear during the dot-com bust. And they've been let down by institutions and companies and organizations that they had faith in. So pair this trend with the fact that boomers are working longer and leaving less room for Gen Xers to move up. And what we find is there is a retention issue with Generation X. Now, the workplace has been so focused on recruiting and retaining millennials that many have failed to see that their next generation of top leaders, the Gen Xers, are leaving. And a new report from Ceridian found that 33% of employed Gen Xers are actively looking for work compared to just 22% of millennials. So a takeaway here, I think the biggest one is don't forget about your Gen Xers. I talk to a lot of Gen Xers who feel like the forgotten middle child in between boomers and millennials, but they need to have career development, opportunities for growth. And even if moving up on the ladder is not possible at your pool right now, they do need to be shown that there is a clear career path down the road. They need to be given opportunities to develop, or else we do see a lot of Gen Xers leaving. So keep that in mind. Regarding their independence, the trend in the workplace over the past 7 years or so has really been towards collaboration. And collaboration is great, but we're seeing a lot of open floor plans, collaborative meeting spaces, things like that. And it's important to remember that we still have to honor independent contribution. And so when you're even looking at an assignment or a project, it's really thinking critically about where can collaboration best serve us and where can we encourage independent contribution. And just because someone wants to work independently doesn't mean that they're a bad team player, but giving people the space to go out and flesh out their own ideas and then perhaps come together in a more collaborative way But just because the current trend is around collaboration doesn't mean that independent contributions are no longer valuable. So keeping that balance in mind. So with that, and again, any questions if there are any questions that have come up on this, Michelle or Stephanie, you can feel free to throw that my way, or we can wait till the end here. But feel free to type those in. And now we'll talk a bit about the millennials. And the major events and conditions that we study with the millennials are technology and how violence was experienced. And I'll start by talking about technology because it's hard to talk about millennials and not start with this. But it was during the formative years of millennials where the internet went social. And that changed everything. Changes the way millennials date, the way that they buy and sell, the way they work and collaborate. But one of the things that also changed was how they were able to have a voice. And every generation of young people has had causes that they fought for. It just so happened that this generation grew up with the loudest megaphone. So a lot of millennials grew up with a feeling of empowerment, that their voice did matter. And they've seen this, it's been encouraged just throughout their formative years. And a recent example was this Delete Uber campaign. And I'm not getting political, I'm just giving this as an example. And some of you may be familiar, but after the first travel ban was announced, at JFK Airport, there were some people who were being held at the airport. And there were a lot of protesters outside wanting these people to be released. And the New York City taxi service went on strike in solidarity with the protesters. And then Lyft, another ride-sharing company, they also went on strike in solidarity with the protesters. And what they were trying to do was make sure that no one was going to get in or out of JFK Airport until these people were released. Well, during that same time frame, Uber lowered their surge prices and continued to go to and from the airport. Well, within a few hours, the hashtag Delete Uber went viral on all three major social media platforms. And within 24 hours, for the first time since the advent of the companies, Lyft was downloaded more times than Uber. And so just by using this collective power on social media, there were a ton of young people who were able to actually change the financial trajectory of a major organization. And so that encouraged this feeling of empowerment, of being able to leverage the collective in order to create the change that you want to see. And so that feeling of empowerment has followed millennials into the marketplace and the workplace as well. The feeling of wanting to have a voice, wanting that voice to be heard. And I'll leave this part at that. And sometimes instead of saying empowered, we say entitled. And I'm more than happy to address some questions on that as well, because entitled is still the main word used to describe millennials, and so something worth addressing. So that's one of the ways that technology has really impacted some of the patterns that we see with millennials. The other thing that we look at is violence. And of course, every generation has had more than their fair share of violence, but with the millennials, we do look at the desks next to us. And these are events like Virginia Tech and Oklahoma City, of course, 9/11 being the biggest, Columbine, the first major school shooting. And there are a lot of studies done to try to understand how this interaction with violence at a young age impacts the psyche of youth. But one area that it impacted that sometimes we forget about is how this impacted the school system. And after Columbine, there was an influx of money that went into the school system for things like guidance counselors. And these guidance counselors, they were trained in trauma. They were not just there to get you out of biology. But there was a recognition that there were 12-year-olds who were scared to go to school, and there were parents who were scared to send them. So you have this generation of young people that were really brought up in a school system that said, bring your voice forward, and adults are here to work with you, not against you. And this was guidance counselors, but also teachers, and it went outside the school system as well to coaches and mentors and priests and rabbis, but no one was doing this more than baby boomer parents. Baby boomer parents and millennial children have a very close relationship. And one of the reasons for this is actually this upsurge in some of this violence. In focus groups with boomers, they'll say, now, these school shootings started happening, and as a parent, you don't know what to do. You kind of hold your kids closer. And some say that this really started the trend of helicopter parenting. But these boomer parents and millennial children, nevertheless, do have this very close relationship. And this has created many interesting trends. For one thing, we see that millennials are very collaborative. And again, if we look at this relationship with their parents, something that we see is baby boomer parents often said to their kids, you can have a voice. We can make decisions together as a family. Or for some of the boomers and Xers who are on this call, you probably maybe grew up in more of a dictatorship, where it's like what mom and dad said, that's just exactly what we did. Where for boomer parents and millennial kids, it was more everyone's got a vote, everyone's got a voice. So that lends itself to being more collaborative and, again, being more empowered. We also find that millennials are in search of meaning, wanting some more meaning in their work. And some of that is tied to some of these trends we see with this interaction with violence at a young age, but part of it is also because of this close relationship with parents. So especially because a lot of their baby boomer parents are on the precipice of retirement. And they're telling their kids, if you're going to work as long and as hard as I have worked, do something you care about, do something that you're passionate about. And young people really took that to heart. So a few takeaways here on that. One, regarding empowerment. In the workplace, find productive ways to bring young people's voices to the table. And this can mean, thinking about programs like reverse mentorship. And reverse mentorship, or sometimes I call it mutually beneficial mentorship, is pairing a senior leader with a newer person and allowing them to both teach each other something, so that it isn't just this downpour of this is how I did it and this is how you can do it, but it's more of an exchange of ideas. You can also come up with problems and give some of your younger people an opportunity to solve them. And so it isn't about listening to a laundry list of complaints. It's about using the energy that they have to have a voice to actually be something productive for your pool. In regards to in search of meaning, I think that you're in a good place for this, the pooling industry, but it is really looking at your recruitment material, the way that you talk about the industry, to decide what is meaningful about what we do. And this doesn't need to be a big, grandiose mission statement. It doesn't need to be, not every organization is curing cancer, but there's a reason that we do what we do. And sometimes we can become removed from that and no longer have that as part of our culture and as part of the way that we bring people in. And so reminding yourself of that and finding ways to communicate that to new people. And also connecting the dots. Well, one thing that I'll hear from millennials in focus groups, the younger millennials, so kind of the 25, 26-year-olds, is they'll say, yeah, I get that my company does good things, but for part of my day, I'm just, I'm in a cubicle filling out an Excel spreadsheet, and I have no idea how or why my work contributes to the bigger goal of this organization. So as a manager, as a leader, it's even saying things, just connecting those dots to say, the work that you do contributes to this bigger picture, connecting people to why they do what they do. The last thing that I'll say about millennials, and this is something that we'll talk about more throughout the year, but is millennial leaders. right? Because the oldest of the millennials is around 36. So we're not just talking about a bunch of 22-year-olds. And millennial leaders, we are finding so many great things, and I'm hearing great things from boomers and Xers as well. Their collaborative spirit oftentimes creates leaders who they have a clear vision, but do want to seek consensus. They want to hear from their people. What matters to you? What direction do you want to take? And that collaborative nature has really lent itself well to a really nice style of leadership that's been well received. Something just to be conscious of is with some millennial leaders, what has been found, and this is outlined more in a white paper that I worked on with Deloitte called the Lucy Report, but it's looking at how for many millennials, they grew up in an environment where the barrier between your personal life and your professional life began to erode, mostly because of social media. So we do sometimes find with millennial leaders, the newer ones, that creating clear boundaries has been sometimes an issue. And really recognizing that if you're leading a group of people, you just have to be a little bit more cognizant of what those boundaries are, the type of information you share, and understanding that your persona at work and your persona at home with your friends and family can be a little different. It doesn't make you an inauthentic leader, but sometimes it can be hard to have authority when you cross that friend versus friendly line. So things to be cognizant of with millennial leaders. And throughout the year, another thing that we will talk about is what happens as millennials buy homes and have kids and enter this new life stage, because we find that millennial family structures differ quite a bit from family structures of the past. We're seeing many more egalitarian marriages. So when we think about things like work-life balance, well, that's become very important to millennials who are having kids now, because oftentimes there is not someone at home who's in charge of the house and someone at work who's in charge of the money. There's definitely a sharing of the load, which creates some different expectations about how we work. So if there are questions about that, I can address those as well. I'm going to take just the last couple minutes here before we open it up just to talk a little bit about Generation Z. And this is the next generation. They're just beginning to enter the workforce now. So I'm not sure if your pools would employ anyone in this age group right now, but it's kind of future looking. I was the head of research on a book that came out a few months ago called Gen Z at Work. And it lays out 7 trends of Gen Z. But one that I want to talk about is basically what I call a participation award is not a real award. And people get pretty excited about this, but we do find with Gen Z that we're seeing this resurgence of a more competitive spirit. We're seeing higher participation rates in competitive sports. I'm collecting stories from parents all the time about their kid getting a participation award and their kid throws it away, finds it meaningless. And this thicker skin, this spirit of competitiveness comes from a few different places. One of the easiest things to pinpoint is Gen X parenting styles, because those Gen Xers who, because of their skepticism, tend to communicate in a way that is very honest and very unfiltered. We're seeing that that's how they're communicating with their kids. So, there are so many Gen X parents who will say to me, my kid got a participation award in softball, and I made sure to tell her, you did not win. You shouldn't display this trophy because you actually lost. They just are giving a trophy to anyone. And I do fall into the millennial category, so I hear these stories and laugh very hard because it's very different from the world I grew up in. But these Gen Xers have really communicated with their children in a way that prepares them for the realities of the world. So even when I have conversations with 14 and 15-year-olds, their understanding of the student loan crisis, their understanding of some of the controversy from this past election is very high because their parents are really giving them some unfiltered information. And that has helped create this thicker skin, this feeling of more competitiveness. And the Gen Zers who I talk to who are in college, they do have this very real understanding that when they step into the workplace and compete for jobs, they're not necessarily just competing with the kids in the desks next to them. They're competing with kids all over the world who can do what they can do, maybe better, maybe for less, and it creates a very different sense of competition. So, every generation brings something new and breathes some new life into the workforce, and Gen Z is definitely going to do that. It's been so wonderful having these focus groups with them and their parents as well. So I'm happy to answer questions on them. So at this point, I will just open it up and see, Michelle and Stephanie, let me know if there were any questions and I can address those. And then right before we get off, I'll give you a quick summary of some of the takeaways that we went over.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kim. Before I ask our first question, I really want to encourage our members who are listening to use that chat box, that question box, to raise any questions that you have so we can leverage this last bit of time that we have with Kim. Kim, the first question that we have coming in is whether you see any certain recruiting style that works best for each of the generations that we discussed.
Yeah, and actually in March, we're going to talk a little bit more about this as well, because it's a little bit of a longer conversation. But one thing that we definitely find is a good recruitment tactic for Gen X is honest and unfiltered communication. On one organization I worked with, on their recruitment website, they actually have a section on there that says, apply for this job. If this is what you're looking for, then you should apply for this job. And they give a list of really what the job entails, what it is. And then they say, if this is what you're looking for, do not apply for this job. And actually one of the things that they put under the do not apply is if you really want a lot of work-life balance. They were very transparent about the fact that this job comes with unpredictable work hours. It comes with quite a bit of travel. And so, and it was a great recruitment tactic because they got the right people to apply for the right job. And if you're not transparent about what your organization really offers, then that's when these massive retention problems come into play, because you've recruited the wrong person for the job. And so, and also just that very transparent communication speaks really loudly to Gen Xers. With millennials, some of and that kind of goes across the board. People want to really know upfront, who are you? What is the type of person that would really fit this? With millennials, one of the recruitment tactics that we see works really well is really highlighting some of your growth and development, focusing on where their careers could go. Because again, we're looking at that generation in their 20s and early 30s when they're really in this growth mindset for their careers. And so they want to have a clear understanding of, if I come and work for you, if I were to dedicate myself to you, what does your dedication look like to me? Where can I go? And so having some of that up front, whether it's on the website or whether it's in initial conversations, has proven to be a great recruitment strategy with millennials.
Thank you for that, Kim. The next question we have is taking a little bit of a different tact and really wondering about how the information you're sharing with us today translates, or if you know how it translates at all, into training teachers who educate K-12 students. Are your clients talking about that? What are you seeing teachers talking about in these generational shifts as it applies to K-12?
So actually, I work with a lot of schools, and it's also where I run a lot of my focus groups, and so they're a great partner. Teachers, I think one of the most interesting conversations that's being had right now in the K through 12 environment is this question of who is really in charge in the classroom. And in a focus group that I was doing with teachers, a lot of them were talking about how when they're teaching a subject, history or something, they've got their students using their smartphones and fact-checking the things that they say, which, as you can imagine, as a teacher, is absolutely infuriating. But these kids have so much access to facts. And I know this isn't new to anyone on this call, but the K through 12 environment is really struggling with figuring out, well, if we no longer really need to teach facts, now how are we teaching young people how to digest these facts? How are we teaching young people to distinguish between the facts that matter and the facts that are real and the ones that are not? How do you teach young people to step outside of their echo chambers to take in disparate information and find resolve? Teaching critical thinking has become a huge thing that's happening in the K through 12 environment, really trying to figure out how that happens. Now, I will tell you, schools move slow, and we are seeing an unprecedented amount of students being pulled from the public school system, being homeschooled, going to private schools, going to charter schools, because you've got these Gen X and millennial parents who are not willing to wait for the school system to figure out these changes, and they're finding alternative routes. So that was a long-winded answer, but if the question is, are the school systems having this conversation? I would say they're having it constantly, which is great. And now it's just a question of how can we actually create change in curriculum in order to better prepare these students for the future and for the jobs that are needed and for the skills that will need, skills around imagination, around creativity, around critical thinking. So that's what the school systems are up against today.
Well, thank you for that, Kim. I think before I came back to public entity pooling, I worked for a university, and they've been talking about this idea of critical thinking and what it means in this world. So for me, it's rewarding to hear that that's also being considered in that K-12 environment and well recognized. And I think that idea of critical thinking is so important to pooling, kind of a rewarding thing out there on the horizon for our future workforce.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to encourage people to keep asking questions. We have about another 8 minutes with Kim. And one of the other questions that we have is, can you talk a little bit about some of the cusp characteristics? I think you'd used the term cusp for folks like going from boomer into Gen X or millennial into Gen Z, and what it means to grow up or to be on those cusps. What strengths do those folks bring, and what perspective might they bring to our workplaces?
Yeah, I mean, the cuspers, being able to translate, I think that they have been critical in the workplace in the past 10 years, because there has just been this strange generational animosity that has come up. A lot of misunderstanding in the workplace, a lot of over sentimentality for the way things were, and a lot of disdain for the way things are. And there's just been some strange things happening with that. And I think that something that cuspers bring that is this huge strength is being able to understand where different groups are coming from, and oftentimes being able to articulate that and serving as these mediators in a way in the workplace. So that is a great strength. And there is an article out there, some of you may have seen it, that talks about the Xennial, which is the millennial Gen X cusper. And it is interesting. I don't really put that into my presentation, because a lot of what's talked about with Xennials has to do more with pop culture than it has to do with behavioral patterns or consumer trends. But if any of you on this call sit in between millennials and Gen Xers, you may just want to Google that, Google Xennial, and you'll find some interesting information from that. And they talk about Dawson's Creek and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and some of the things that you may be nostalgic for. So there's some information specifically on that group.
Thank you for that, Kim. We've got another question coming in and about 6 minutes left. So the next question is, can you talk about some of the ways to discuss with millennials that not everything is collaborative and that some things just are the way that they are?
Yeah. One tip here is to explain the why, because if you've got a young person who's coming in and they're saying, I want to change this and this doesn't seem to be working for us anymore, if your answer is, this is the way it is because I said so, then I do think that it's actually time for the pool to possibly reevaluate that. Because if the only reason that you have something in place is just because you said so and because it's always been there, then maybe you can relook at it. But if there is a reason, and there are so many reasons for some of the things in the workplace. Sometimes you're up against budget constraints. Sometimes there's regulatory laws, there's compliance, there's all of these things that contribute to why a decision is made or why something is the way it is. But for some of your younger people and for some of the people newer to pooling, they may just be unfamiliar. So if you can just take that extra couple minutes to say, this is why it is the way it is, that can go a long way.
Thank you for that. I think that idea of thinking about the why applies to so many of the things we do in public entity pooling, and we were just having that conversation ourselves here earlier today. We've got about 4 minutes left, Kim, and one of the things I wanted to ask is whether there were a couple of points when you were talking to us that you said, there were areas that you might provide a little bit more insight. And I'm wondering if there's anything with that in mind that you'd like to touch on that maybe we didn't reach into deep enough, or you'd like to go a little bit further on?
Well, sometimes that's dependent on what people are interested in. I can just say from a purely selfish standpoint, I think the millennial parenting information has been particularly interesting. I started about 8 months ago I'm running 600 interviews right now with fathers between the ages of 27 and 40 to understand how the social construction of fatherhood has changed over time. And I actually think that how families are formed and shaped has huge implications on the workplace. And I think this rise in egalitarian marriages is going to create some changes in the workplace that the workplace may not be ready for. I was working with a big investment bank a few months ago, and they were saying, the job is incredibly demanding. There's a lot of travel. There's very long hours, and they had to get accustomed to losing their top performing women after they had their first kid. But now, for the first time, they're losing a lot of their men after the second kid, because there is an expectation now that fathers are more involved on the home front and carrying more of that load. And also the women are carrying more of the financial load. And so it used to be more appropriate to have many of these industries and many of these jobs where it was like, your job's got to be your life. And if you're the sole breadwinner, then you don't really have a choice. But now with two financially contributing spouses and fathers more involved on the home front, that has changed. And so, I think just something to be aware of moving into the future is, and I hate even, this work-life balance. I think that's just, we're kind of beating a dead horse with that. But I do think that really understanding the fact that you have these young parents who are not willing to make the same sacrifices as previous generations will really change what motivates people in the workplace and the type of balance that's really required to make work life and home life both viable. So And Stephanie and Michelle at AGRiP both know this, but I also very recently had my first child. So just personally, I'm interested in the topic. But the white paper on millennial parenting is coming out in September, so I can keep people in the loop on that.
Thank you, Kim. This is Michelle at AGRiP. I know this is the first time we've chimed in. But we have one last question here, and I've got 2:59, so I know that we're right at the edge, but if everybody doesn't mind a couple more minutes. We have a question here that's, how do we get millennials and Gen Zers interested in a company that has very little social interaction or advanced technological options? And the reason I wanted to just take a couple more minutes to talk about this question is because we have been doing a lot of work looking for why, both the why of pooling and individual why, and sharing our stories and our mission. And I think that keeps coming through as one way that we can connect pooling and local government, which you mentioned earlier, maybe isn't so sexy, with younger generation. So I'm just wondering if you have any tips or closing thoughts for best practices for sharing about your value proposition.
Yeah. So forgive me, but I'm going to have to focus on one of them because millennials and Gen Z, they're actually very different. So let me talk about Gen Z for a minute because, you know, that meaning, yes, that's important. Why we do what we do, yes, that's important. But I will tell you, Gen Z is looking for stability much more than millennials were. And a lot of this has to do with the recession happening during their formative years. And I'll be in focus groups with teenagers and they'll tell me stories about their parents getting laid off. A lot of them talk about their millennial siblings. You know, they'll talk about their older brother who they thought their older brother was just the coolest and could do no wrong. And all of a sudden, older brother graduates college in 2009. There are no jobs to be had. This person who you idolized is back home living in the basement on the couch. And that really impacted Gen Z. And so, yes, you know, the meaning and some of those aspects are important to talk about because they matter, because just from a human level, we all want to believe in what we're doing. But for Gen Z, they also are acutely aware of the fact that not everybody gets jobs and not everybody gets to keep them. And so also really focusing on that stability. I think Gen Z will be much less likely than millennials to chase the cool factor, which I think is a really great sign for pooling, because I don't think that you necessarily have to position yourself as the coolest place to work. I don't think you need to have, you know, a water slide going down to the break room. I don't think you need nap pods. I think if you can, you know, give people dedication, if you can give them stability with this new generation, that will speak very loudly.
Well, thank you so much, Kim, for your time today. I want to take a moment just to close out the session by also thanking our attendees for being with us, to highlight a couple of things that are coming up. Kim has mentioned a couple of times that she is working on the intelligence publication that we put out. She'll be able to get a lot more information in just a few weeks about some of her work and some of her general residency work that she's doing with AGRiP. If you're going to join us at the Governance and Leadership Conference in San Diego, you'll get to see and meet with her firsthand and to learn even more. We mentioned earlier that we'll have webinar slides from this presentation available on the AGRiP website soon. And if you guys have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to send us an email and we will work on getting those answers together for you. With that, thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful remainder of your day. Special thanks to Kim Lear, the AGRiP Generational Resident, for her time today. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kim. Bye-bye.